In today's Training Focused, I want to talk about determining the manner of death and a few of the nuances that go into actually determining a manner. As with a lot of things in our world, we think that it should be simple. Determining manner of death, there are 5 of them, right? There are accident, there is homicide, suicide, natural, and then the dreaded undetermined. Although undetermined is a real manner, sometimes it just is undetermined. And sometimes the manner it's easy, right? If someone walks up to another person unprovoked and shoots them and they die, well, that's homicide. But sometimes it's not so straightforward. And because, not only cause, but because cause and manner of death are opinions. Now, causes are not always opinions. There are sometimes a cause of death will lead to a manner that can be opinion. But the manner of death are opinions, and they're judgments. And based upon that judgment, there's a formula for both reporting the manner on the death certificate, but also there are some degrees of certainty that go into determining that manner. And what I mean by that is there are cases where I might feel like it is an accident, and another coroner or pathologist, medical examiner, might feel that it's a natural death, might feel that it's even a homicide. And you're like, well, how can that be such a big swing? Because there are cases out there that are not straightforward. Manners are based upon opinions, and opinions are derived from the facts of the case, but also from education. And unfortunately, it's sometimes from how a person sees a thing or sees an action. Now, we should not do that. We should not put our, almost said opinions, and I'm telling you the manner of death is based upon opinions, and I almost said we shouldn't put our opinions in there, but you see the problem. We should not put our opinions in there, but they are based upon opinions. So, for instance, autoerotic fatality, that's a big one. There's times that we may feel like this autoerotic death should be more classified as a suicide because the person should have known the risk, but it's not. The autoerotic accident, if it's a true autoerotic accident, they simply were involved in sexual play and died accidentally. And of course, the big obvious one is Russian roulette. And if you've been around my channel for a while, taking any of my classes, watching YouTube, you'll know that I have a little bit of a different opinion on Russian roulette. There are many pathologists out there that will say Russian roulette is a suicide, full stop. They should have known the danger. Okay, they should have known the danger, but if I decide to go tightrope walking at a 40-story building and I've never done it before and I fall off, are you going to say that was an accident or a suicide? I should have known the danger. And sometimes when guns are involved, we kind of elevate things. Oh, it's a big, scary gun. Well, you know, if it's a one round in a cylinder, the person's home alone, they're found a day later or hours later, then we don't know. We may very well have to rule that a suicide, especially if we find ideation or something like that. But I'll get into these degrees of certainty in a moment. You'll see why that's a little bit harder to determine. But if they're at a party and they're talking about how tough they are and they throw one round in a cylinder or spin it, put it to their head, and it goes click, well, luckily it didn't go off, but they're just showing how brave they are, so to speak. If they're drunk, high, things like that. But if that goes bang, it's hard to really say that's a suicide when witnesses are around saying, well, look, this is what happened. You know, John did it and it went click. So Bobby thought he was just as tough. So he did it and it went bang. But there was no suicide intent. You know, it was, and, you know, I forget the percentages off the top of my head, but, you know, if you got 1 round in a 5-round cylinder or 1 round in a 6 or a 9-round cylinder, you know, it gets to be like 20%. 17% and like 11%. So if you got 1 round in a 9-round cylinder, you only got 11% chance it's going to go off. So it's hard to say that that's a suicide just because the gun's involved. But again, that's what I rabbit trailed there for a minute, but that's what I mean by opinion. Some are going to say, well, it's a gun, full stop, it's suicide, no more conversation. I had a gentleman die a couple of years ago, several years ago now. He had seen on this 101 Ways to Die TV show, something, some guy tried to swallow a fish and it got caught and he couldn't pull it back out because of the dorsal fins and he ended up choking to death. He died, asphyxiation. So this guy on our riverbank decided, he was drunk and he was tough and he was going to show that it could be done. But he died. He choked and he died. You would thought he would have figured that out. But anyway, the point is, was that a suicide? He watched a TV show. He knew the person died. He knew it was very likely that he might choke and die, but he did it anyway. And he did choke and die. I couldn't call that a suicide. There was no suicidal intent. There was no ideation. There was no reason to believe it was suicide. He was just trying to swallow a fish. Now, if there was a category of stupid, then we could have ruled that a stupid death. But unfortunately, we don't have that category. But it's not suicide, even though the behavior was risky, and even though he knew from a TV show that someone else had died from it, he did it anyway. So because of that, many times the manner of death is not only opinion-based, it's also based upon the circumstances surrounding the death. So we have to look at all of it before we can make a manner determination. So degrees of certainty. When we're talking about degrees of certainty, this comes from the National Association of Medical Examiners put out a guide for manner of death classifications. And in there, it is a guide, and they say it is a guide. It's not the law. And they give several case examples and what they as an organization believe it should be ruled. But let's talk about degrees of certainty as out of their guide. Undetermined, less than 50%. Now, where do you come up with these percentages? There's no math. There's no, this action accounts for 5%, and if they're over 65, that's 20%. If they're under 10 years old, that's a 3%. There's no form. The degree of certainty comes from how we see a case. Many of you can probably relate to times something has occurred or something, and you say, I'm 70 to 80% sure that person's lying. I'm 90% sure that this is what happened. That's where that comes from. That's what these percentages are. Now, they should be based upon the scene. They should be based upon circumstances. Unfortunately, they're also based upon our personalities, our life experiences, our case experiences. If we see more cases of a certain kind, then we're going to start forming opinions based upon those cases. But again, those degrees of certainty comes from how we see the case. And generally, we're all about the same. But again, this gives you kind of a point system in your, so to speak, as to how these things can be ruled. So undetermined, less than 50%, which means you can't even be 50-50 sure whether it's homicide, suicide, or accident, or natural. You don't know. You can't even get to a 50-50 chance, so it's undetermined. Now we say a reasonable, that's a big word here, reasonable medical or investigative probability, which means it's greater than a 50-50 chance. So many times that's going to be more your natural causes. You've got a older person, a lot of health history, cardiac history, in his own bed, locked in a house, by himself, wife home, maybe she sleeps in another room, whatever the circumstances, and he woke up dead this morning. There's no trauma. There's nothing to lead you believe that he was poisoned or asphyxiated. The scene looks proper. And it's a reasonable medical or investigative probability that he died of natural causes because there's nothing to lean you the other way. And really, that's like a 50-50 chance. Now, obviously, we start maybe going up in the 60, 70, 80% chance when we don't see anything else around the scene that would lead us to believe otherwise. But that's kind of where we get naturals most of the time. But then also, we can lean into preponderance of medical and investigative evidence. So if you do have that person that is a lot of health history, been declining, you can chart their decline, what's been going on with them, then you can get to that 60, 70% a preponderance of medical and investigative evidence. So that's about 70%. So if we have that, we say that preponderance of medical evidence, more so than not, that's 70%. That's also where we have to be for suicide. Before we rule a death a suicide, we need to be 70% sure that it was suicide. The CME, the coroner medical examiner, investigators, or pathologists, the CMEs, and law enforcement should always agree. Always agree. If at the end of the investigation, both parties do their independent investigations. If you all both can't say, yes, we are 70% sure or greater that this was suicide, then rule it undetermined. It'll haunt you if one of you don't agree. So that's suicide. Then you've got clear and convincing medical investigative evidence. Clear and convincing. So you have reasonable, 50-50. Preponderance means I've got more on my scale on the side that to show suicide, to show heart attacks. That's preponderance. Clear and convincing, that is 90%. Clear and convincing. And then we have beyond any reasonable doubt. That's 100%. And beyond any doubt can be tough. But again, if unprovoked, not self-defense, unprovoked, I walk up and shoot somebody, that's homicide. 100% clear and convincing. So there's where your degrees of certainty come from. So when we're talking about these, and I'll recap, natural have to be at least 50%. Now, generally, your naturals are going to be 60 to 70 because you've got the medical history and you've got a lot of things. But if you can't even reach 50% on a natural, then it's undetermined. Accidents, 55 to 60. You've got to be sure that it wasn't anything else. I know it's not a homicide. I know it wasn't a suicide. So my question is it natural or accident? And what comes to mind there is the but-for factor. So let's say someone is swimming in the lake, having fun swimming, and they have a heart attack, and they slip underwater, and they drown. Is that an accidental drowning, or is that a natural? So it would be ruled an accident if you have evidence of the heart attack, and you have clear and convincing evidence that it had a heart attack. It would be ruled an accident. Well, why wouldn't that be a natural? It's because of the but-for. But for the water, he might have lived. There are lots of people who have heart attacks and live. Just because you have a heart attack doesn't mean you're going to die. You might die. Many do die, but most, their first heart attacks, they live. Well, maybe I shouldn't say most, but I don't know that percentage. But a great number of people have heart attacks that live. So if he was on the riverbank and he had a heart attack, the chances are much higher that he would have been alive. But for the fact that he was in the water, he drowned, which would have caused that to be an accident, even though what started it was the heart attack. He couldn't recover himself, so that was an accident. Of course, suicide, 70%, homicides are 90%. Manner of death certification should be objective and based on simple, established criteria. Some of that's through the name guidelines. Some of that is through your own experience and your own department policy. But here's a big warning. They should never be formulated or decided upon because you are trying to facilitate prosecution or you're trying to avoid publicity, challenging publicity. Everybody wants this person to be, ruled homicide, but it's not a homicide. It was self-defense would be homicide, but it was an accident. Everybody wants it to be your homicide, and you're pressure to rule something a homicide, but it was not a homicide. It was an accident. Then you should rule it based upon the facts, not because it's it's going to be publicly challenged. You should never rule something based upon a political base or promoting personal philosophy or agenda. You should never do anything to help the prosecution where, I'm going to rule it this way so it looks better for prosecution. You should never do that. If you have a personal philosophy or agenda, maybe it's a LGBTQ thing or some other hot button topic, you may have a personal opinion on and a death may occur in around this thing. You should never rule it based upon your personal opinions. It should always, always, always be, for instance, if person A is heterosexual, person B is homosexual, and person A has said some disparaging things about homosexual, but in some way there was a situation that occurred and person B died. And it looks very well like it's an accident. Person A had no intentions of killing person B. There was no intent. There was no overt actions, whatever the case may be. But somehow someone says, well, person A has been talking disparaging and he's says bad words about him and things like that. And then, you have a very, you're very sensitive to the LGBTQ, sorry, I can't get all that right, plight. So you're going to say, well, I want to rule this homicide. I mean, y'all may think it's accident, but I think he meant to do it because, I have a heart for the gay community, and this guy has said bad things about gay people in the past. So to me, it looks like a homicide. So I want to rule a homicide. That's wrong. If it's a homicide, it's a homicide. That's fine. But if you're ruling it that way because you're leaning further because of your personal convictions, that is not a proper manner of death. In fact, that should be illegal, and you should go to jail. If you can stand on your report and not fudge it, right, not put fancy words in there, but stand on your report and be truthful, then that's fine. It is a homicide or it is an accident. But don't let your personal philosophies get in the way. It happens. We're human, and it can happen. So let's talk about what makes some of these. So an accident. An accident applies when an injury or a poisoning causes the death, and there is little or no evidence that the injury occurred with the intent to harm or cause death. Now, that could be suicide or a homicide. So the fatal outcome was unintentional. So maybe I drank too much alcohol and I died of alcohol poisoning, or maybe I took the wrong medication or something. Maybe an older person forgot they took their meds, and then that caused them really to forget the meds. So they took their meds again, and they died of an overdose. That's not there was no intent to harm. There wasn't a suicide. But an accident is when there is an injury or a poisoning, like an overdose or something, that was unintentional. Now, suicide results from injury or poisoning as a result of intentional, self-inflicted act to commit self-harm or cause death. Someone does a thing with the intent to die. They know that doing this thing will end their life, and they do it for the purpose of ending their life, period. That's suicide. There's no ambiguity. There's no confusion. I am going to jump off this viaduct. I'm going to jump in front of a FedEx tractor trailer, and I'm going to die. That's why I'm doing it. Well, that's a little different than I'm going to be jumping in the river off this bridge. I'm just too stupid to know that it's too tall and the river's too shallow, and all of a sudden I hit the bottom and I die. I'm just trying to, we're trying to jump off the bridge. Last year, the water was deeper. We did just fine. This time, the water wasn't as deep. So what was the intention of the person? Homicide occurs when the death results from a volitional or a voluntary act committed by another person. And here's what's interesting. And I'm reading the definition from name. From another person to cause fear, harm, or death. Intent to cause death is a common element, but is not required for classification as homicide. It is to be emphasized that the classification of homicide for the purpose of death certification is a neutral term, neither indicates nor implies criminal intent, which remains a determination within the province of the legal process. So what does that mean? If a police officer is being shot at and he shoots back and kills someone, that is homicide. But that's a justifiable homicide. Our job as CMEs is to say homicide. Somebody else's job to determine if it's justified. If I'm a homeowner and someone is kicking in my door at 2 a.m, yelling and screaming about, I'm going to kill you and rape your kids, and that door gets kicked in, and they take one step into my foyer, and I shoot them and kill them, that's homicide. Clear and simple. But that can be ruled justified. Our job as a CME, and this is where law enforcement and CMEs work together, but CME is to determine the manner of death. Whether it's criminal or not, that's up to somebody else. That is not up to us. I can take a car accident. I can look at the circumstances of the car accident, even if the person driving was intoxicated. And they went off the road, overturned, hit a tree, killed the passenger. That is still an accidental death. Now, the prosecution may certainly charge the driver with vehicular homicide or manslaughter or whatever it is you have in your jurisdiction, whatever element of the crime you have. From a CME perspective, that's still an accident. That person was drunk. He got in a car. He didn't intend. We don't have evidence to show that he intended to go off the road and hit a tree. So that would be an accident. It does not mean that the driver is not guilty of a crime, but us as CMEs, it's not our job to determine the crime. It's to determine the manner. Are you tracking with me here? So we don't try to help prosecution. We don't help or hurt. We just rule the death. Prosecution can do. I can rule an accident, and somebody can still go to prison for murder. I can rule a drug overdose, a heroin overdose, overdose, but the person that sold it to him or gave it to him could still go to prison for murder. How I rule the manner has nothing necessarily to do with the prosecution. I just have to stand on my ruling. Well, let's go back up to the first sentence on homicide. When a volitional act committed by another person to cause fear, harm, or death. And in this name guideline, there are several examples. And for instance, if I'm robbing a bank and you've seen those TV shows, you've got the 60, 70-year-old, 80-year-old guy. Well, not 60 necessarily. It's closer to 60 I get. 60 ain't old anymore. Some of you all down there in the 20s are thinking 60 is old. At my age, 60 is like right around the corner, like in a couple of years. It ain't that old. So let's say that some 75-year-old bank guard there, he dressed up in a uniform, he's got a gun, and he's supposed to be the security guard. Well, somehow I'm robbing a bank, and I scare the guy, and I point a gun at him, and it's a whole big situation. He's nervous and scared. He has a heart attack and dies. That can be ruled a homicide just because he had a heart attack. He had a heart attack because I did the act I did. If someone is coming into a room and you're standing behind the door and you go boo really loud, scare them, and they fall over with a heart attack, that's homicide according to name standards. So if I do an act that causes fear, harm, or death, that's a homicide. If there's a road rage incident and I'm chasing you in your car and you're scared and you're trying to run away from me and you get in an accident and die because I am chasing you, that's a homicide. Even though you were driving and you lost control and you went off the road and you hit the tree, you're running away from me because I'm chasing you. You're scared of me. I have caused that. Homicide can be a little bit, again, it's based upon the facts of the situation. And then undetermined or could not be determined or indeterminate. Indeterminate is a big word. That means, to everybody's knowledge, it cannot be and never will be determined. Undetermined is we can't determine it now, but with more evidence, we might be able to. There's a lot of infant deaths now. Instead of ruling something SIDS, we're ruling it indeterminate, which means we have exhausted everything. It is unable to be determined. Now, that doesn't mean, really, in a year or two, if somebody comes up and confesses that they smothered the baby with a pillow or some other thing happened, that we can't change that official ruling. But that just means of all the investigation we've done, it's indeterminate. So undetermined is a better one, but indeterminate seems a bit more final, okay? It's classified when the information pointing to one manner of death is no more compelling than a competing manner. Again, you're not even 50-50 sure. This could have been an accident, could have been a natural. This could have been a suicide, could have been an accident. Did he mean to shoot himself, or was he just cleaning the gun and it went off? We have enough compelling evidence both ways, and we just have to rule it undetermined. Either A, you do not have enough information even to get close to anything, a manner, or you have enough. This might be an accident. This might be a suicide. I have evidence. I could go either way. Like I could write a narrative. I could base it on facts. I could be truthful and honest without any bias, and I could go either way and rule this an accident or a natural, or accident or a suicide. But because there's not enough one way or the other, I'm going to rule it undetermined because I can't. The scales are balanced. There's no preponderance on either side, so that would be an undetermined death. And it's always best to do that than just to pick one, because you don't have enough clear, convincing facts to rule one way or the other. So in general, if a death involves a combination of natural processes and external factors such as injury or poisoning, preference is given to the non-natural manner of death. So in an undetermined, it could be natural, but if there are external injuries, such as accidental injuries or poisonings or something or falls, then we would more rule it into the accidental stage, okay? Without any of that, we would stay on the natural side. So I hope through a little bit of that, you could see that a manner of death is easy, but manner of death also has some nuances in it. And this is why you may get a little bit of discrepancies between one pathologist and another. And this is also, cause isn't as much, but manner certainly is. And I would suggest you go on to the name, National Association of Medical Examiners. Go to their website. It's free. Go to the guide for manner of death classifications. Download it. Like I said, it's free. Read through it. And they also give you some case examples, like what if this happens? What if that happens? You might be able, you should rule it this way. You can rule it that way. And it's really educational to see how NAME puts out guidance to their pathologists on how to rule things. Again, they don't have to, it's only a guide, but it gives you a lot of insight. So I would suggest you go to their website and get that. So I hope throughout these last few minutes, you really, really understand how manner of death is determined and how it's not necessarily straightforward. And this again shows why the law enforcement and the CMEs have to work closely together, because the information that both sides come up with can tip the scales one way or the other to a manner. So the law enforcement has to be very, very vocal and sharing with the CME and vice versa so that you can come up with the same determinations. CMEs can't make determinations in a vacuum. I've got a body with a hole in it, and evidence shows that it was created by a bullet because I had the bullet still in the body, and so it was a gunshot injury. Now, I don't know at this point if it's suicide, homicide, or accident. It's my investigation and a law enforcement investigation that's going to come together for us to make that ruling. So, again, manner of death. Really get to understand it, really get to know it, and how they can be a little bit subjective. And it'll start helping you in your next cases. Probably you'll find some that's like, okay, now I really need to think about this. And it'll help you become a much, much better investigator. Hey, if you have not subscribed to the Death Investigator magazine, you need to do that today. This is a free online magazine, comes to your inbox every single month, and it is dedicated to the field of death investigation and all of those supporting roles. Each edition is packed with timely articles, interactive links to videos and audio training, and lots of extra. Articles are written by industry professionals. There's training announcements from various organizations across the country. And best of all, it's focused around our profession and our lives. There's articles in there that not only help you be a better investigator, but there's articles to help you be a better human, to be better in your family, to be better in your finances. This publication is a well-rounded publication that is focused on you. So subscribe today. Go to deathinvestigatormagazine.com and get your first free issue and then one each month thereafter.